We're very pleased to welcome Leandro Garcia with us for another session as part of our series on systems thinking. Leandro Garcia is a lecturer in complexity science in public health at the Center for Public Health, Queen's University Belfast. He works in the development of on the development and application of systems thinking and complex systems methods to investigate and develop public and planetary health challenges. Leandro is also the co-lead for the Center of Public Health Complexity, Public Health and Planetary Health Cluster, a member of the World Health Organization Collaborating Center for the Research and Training on Complex Systems, Network Science for Non-Communicable Disease Prevention, Control, and a member of the Systems Evaluation Network Organizing Committee. So I'll pass now to Leandro for the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, and everyone for joining this workshop. So I'll be talking today about drawing causal loop diagrams. I hope everyone can see my screen well. So in the next 40 minutes or so, I'd like to just want to talk with you about a few steps that overall usually will take when we're thinking and drawing a causal loop diagram. So I'll first walk through an overview of these steps. Then I will talk about problem definition reference mode, which is the first step for building a CLD. Then explaining some of the main aspects of factor variable elicitation, then structural elicitation, some advice in terms of model review after the structure has been developed, and show you or give you some tips in terms of tools and other references that you can use to continue studying drawing CLDs. The way I organized this session today is that at the end of each one of these main steps, we're going to have 5 minutes for burning questions. So if you have any questions that you want to ask specifically at that point, you can write it in the Q&A box we have here available for us, or you can raise your hand at the end of that point. I'm going to have time for that, and also at the end we're going to have a longer time for discussion and Q&A as well. So if I can't address your question at that point, or if you don't have a question at that point, we're going to still have some space for Q&A and discussion at the end, like around 20 minutes. Okay. So in terms of the steps to build a CLD, I don't know how many of you have been in the past workshop, so I'll very briefly define what a causal loop diagram is. So it is everything on the name. So a causal loop diagram is a visual representation of causal relationships that can be cyclic. So that's all a causal loop diagram is. And we use causal loop diagrams when we want to identify the structure of systems that generate certain patterns, certain events that we observe in the real world. So that's the main goal of building causal loop diagrams. But to be able to reach this point, actually we need to start from the very top of this pyramid. So the first thing we need to do is to define the problem of interest, which is usually defined based on the events or patterns that we observe in the real world. Once we define the problem of interest, the next step is to build a reference mode, which is, I'm going to explain, of course, in more details next, but that relates with the patterns and trends that we observe in the real world, and also that we expect to observe in the future. Based on the reference mode, then we elicit variables or factors that we believe contribute to the observed patterns or the expected patterns. or are consequences of these patterns. After we listed the variables, then we start to list the relationship between these variables, so the structure of these causal relationships, and that at the end lead us to the creation of the causal loop diagram. So I'm going to walk through each one of these steps in the session today. So the first part is to define the problem and the reference mode that will guide us in the steps of eliciting the variables and then eliciting the structure next. So in terms of the problem of interest, there is certain types of problems that are suitable to be investigated using causal loop diagrams. And overall, I guess the best way to describe what kind of questions we would try to address using causal loop diagrams are mechanistic questions that, in principle at least, or intuitively, can be answered via dynamic hypothesis. And by dynamic hypothesis, I mean an explanation of how these patterns and mechanisms work that involve dynamic relationship between these factors. And that will be clear as we move along in this presentation. So one example of a problem of interest that is suitable to be investigated through causal loop diagram, for instance, is what does make or would make cycling attractive and easy for women, for instance. Okay, so it is a mechanistic question that at least at the very beginning, intuitively, we can think that involve many factors and that these factors interact between themselves over time, so in a dynamic way. So at least intuitively, it seems that even though we didn't build, of course, the dynamic hypothesis yet or the causal loop diagram yet, it seems that can be addressed via causal diagram. A question that wouldn't be suitable to answer via causal diagram would be something, for instance, like, does a biker scheme X increase cycling among women? So it is a question about the effectiveness of an intervention. So it's less mechanistic and much more effective kind of effectiveness, kind of question. So that kind of question is less suitable or unsuitable in general to be answered to a causal diagram. And I hope in the next step, in next stages, that'll be clear why one of the question is more suitable than the other. So once we define a research question, we have a problem of interest. The next step is to build a reference mode. So a reference mode is a fancy name for a chart showing the behavior over time or the temporal trend or a pattern of a given variable. Okay. To build a reference mode, we have a few steps. So the first step is to define a key indicator that represents your problem of interest. So if you're speaking about, in this case, cycling among women, or the reasons or the factors that could contribute to make easier cycling among women, then perhaps a key variable that represents our problem is actually the levels of cycling among women, right? So if I wanted to know whether a situation is improving or not, probably I would use the levels of cycling among women as an indicator of that situation. So that's the guiding question to try to identify a key indicator for your problem of interest. Some people sometimes ask whether we can have more than two indicators, two variables, more than one, like two or three. My suggestion is always to keep it to a minimum, and probably hope that'll be clear in the next slides as well. If you have one, that's great. If you need more than one for any other reason, I wouldn't have more than two in the same causal loop diagram, more than two indicators that represent your problem of interest. And the reason is that in the next steps, we need to list the variables and list the structure that contribute to the changes or not of that key indicator. So if you have multiple key indicators, that basically mean that you might end up with a much bigger system or causal diagram, actually, then it's necessary or is even intelligible at some point. So by increasing the number of key indicators, you're basically expanding also the work you need to do in the next steps. That's another problem per se, extending the amount of work, is the readability of your model after you finish your CLD development process. So once you define the key indicator that represents your problem of interest, the next thing that we do is to determine a time horizon long enough to see the dynamics play out, which means in this case is, for instance, in terms of, again, going back to our example of cycling among women. So the levels of cycling among women wouldn't change in a sustainable way if we just observe the behavior of that indicator, let's say for a couple of weeks, right? So in a couple of weeks, we don't have time enough for the dynamics of the factors that determine the levels of cycling to play out completely, right? So we probably need a few years, perhaps even a decade or so. So depending on the key indicator and how quick that key indicator changes over time or can be changing over time depending on, let's say, interventions, you might need time horizons that are longer or shorter. So if you have something that, let's say, an epidemic, right, or an outbreak, not even an epidemic, an outbreak in a school, that the dynamics maybe plays out much quicker, like a week or so, you might have perhaps a time horizon that is just a couple of days or a couple of weeks, a month or 2 months. Now, if you have problems where the key indicator takes much longer to change, or the contributors to the change of that key indicator take very long to play out, you need to extend the time horizon of your chart. The next step then is to draw the observed behavior of the indicator until present. If you have data, so if you, in your case, if you have annual levels of cycling among women, you can use that data to help you draw your line, going back, based on your time horizon until present. If you don't have data, the key thing here is that you draw the line that represents the pathway or the expected time trend. So it's much more important that you know how the shape of the line, the shape of the trend, more than the exact values, okay? So if you don't have any data at all, or if you have just some data points within your time horizon, that's not a problem per se. You still can draw a behavioral time graph, because again, the key point here is that the pathway, the shape of the behavior over time is captured and not exactly the values, okay? And the last stage then is to draw the expected, the hoped, and the feared behavior of the indicator into the future, okay? I will show an example in the next slide. So this is an example, again, about cycling trips among women. This comes from a project we developed together with Sustrans in the Republic of Ireland. So here we have in the blue line representation of the levels of cycling among men, just as a counterfactual, perhaps not a counterfactual, but also to have a sense of the disparities among sex. And then we have the orange line representing the levels of cycling among women from 2009 to 2021, data that is collected through the National Travel Survey. So that's the observed trend, the observed behavior of your system over this period of time. What we see here in the dashed lines is what was suggested by workshop participants about what would be the most likely behavior of the trend over time to 2043. The desired behavior of that trend and the feared behavior of that trend. So this gives a sense of how the system behaved in the past and what is likely to behave in the future, and what we as, or those participants in the workshop, would like to see happening and would like to see not happening in the future. And the reason why we draw this reference mode is because if we remember again, when we saw that pyramid with events, trends or patterns, and the structures, we need to find structures that help to explain these patterns over time. So to be able to identify and list the variables in the structure in the next stages, we first need to understand how the system is behaving or behaved in the past and is expected to behave in the future, or what would make it behave in the desired way or in the feared way in the future. So drawing the reference mode is a key step to guide our thinking in what is going to become the CLD in the next steps. Any questions about reference mode or the problem of interest at this point? See here if there's anything there. I can see the Q&A directly. 1 second. If you want to raise your hand or not write in the Q&A, that's also okay. Yes, Connie.
Hi, Leandro. Thanks very much for presenting for us. I guess I was just wondering, with the observed behavior, would you always recommend that it is the behavior, like travel behavior, rather than availability of, say, healthy infrastructure or acceptability of? Is it sort of more straightforward to go for the actual behavior, I guess, you want to see changed in the end?
Yeah, that's a good question. So here, I guess the word behavior has 2 different meanings, right? Because we're speaking about the behavior of the individuals, which is captured to the levels of cycling, and there's the behavior of the system, which is captured by the key indicator, which is in this case levels of cycling. So it doesn't need to match. So the key indicator doesn't need to be a behavioral indicator, could be any sort of indicator that you feel would be a good indicator of a problem of interest. So if you had to monitor the behavior of your system, or monitor the problem of how the problem of interest is evolving, what would be the key one? If you had just 1 or 2 to select, what would that be? So that's why we selected that one in that case.
Right, that's really useful. Thank you.
Any other questions? No? Okay, so I'll continue. You can come back to these points after at the end as well. So the next step.
Sorry, Leandro, before you go on, a question just come through. A question here says, does the reference mode indicate the system's existing state, patterns, and the desired state / future or focus is on trend?
So let me see here. Does the reference mode indicate the system's existing? Okay, so the focus is actually on both. So the reason that we use the data that either the data that already exists about the trends, or knowledge about how the trend might look like. Again, not in terms of numeric precision, but in terms of the shape of this behavior. So here it's a very flat line, right? But you could have, depending on the factors you're looking for. So I teach a class on systems thinking, public health, and the students need to develop a causal diagram. They select their own topics. So one group was discussing cholera outbreaks, I think in Sudan. Their graph was very different from this one. So there was a lot of oscillations, of course, because they were tracking numbers of cases, right? So, and that's very seasonal. So it was it's a very different type of graph, right? With some peaks some oscillations that are much smaller in magnitude. They had data for that indicator specifically, but even if you didn't have, they could still draw the oscillation behavior based on the knowledge they have, information about, especially if they're experts on communicable disease or infectious diseases, they could still draw that line. So drawing the line in the past is important to understand how the system's, the current state of the system. Drawing the lines in the future also help us to understand leverage points, perhaps, and factors and relationships that are potentially dormant, or they are potentially, feedback loops that perhaps are balancing each out. But we need to still describe in the model, otherwise we won't be able to explain how the desired behavior would be achieved, or how the feared behavior would be achieved. So we draw both parts with the same intent, trying to figure out what are the factors and relationships that are responsible for the current state, the current shape of this trend, and B could be contributors, for the possible future behavior. Hope that answers your question. Okay. I will continue, and then you can come back to more things about reference mode after. So the next step then is a factor and variable elicitation. So once we define how the system behave and it's likely to behave in the future, the next step then is to elicit what factors or variables can contribute to that patterns. So using the reference mode, we ask ourselves two questions. What does contribute to the time trends observed? And what are the consequences of these time trends? Note here that I use contribute and consequences, and I use these two elements, or I ask these two questions purposefully at this stage, even though at the end, because it is a causal diagram, they are not actually contributors and consequences with that very sharp distinction, because consequences now can contribute to time trends in the future, right? But the reason why I tend to divide these two questions is because more often than not, we tend to think in problems in terms of determinants and consequences, right? So it is easier when we start the elicitation process to make that distinction. Although as we move along in the process, this is going to be blurred, basically. Okay, so that also means that if you have a factor that you don't know whether it's a contributor or a consequence, because sometimes it's a contributor, sometimes it's a consequence, that doesn't matter. You just need to list that variable as an important contributor or consequence. So two key things here is that try always to remember that we're not trying to draw the whole system. It's very easy at this point just to have a very long list of contributors and a very long list of consequences. And that happens because we just keep adding things, thinking that everything might be important and everything might have their relevance. But in this case, we need to be careful and always consider that we don't want to draw the whole system, but only what is critical to the theme being addressed. So the equivalent here is to have a map, right? In, let's say, a physical map, or even in Google Maps, that is so detailed that you cannot even use, right? Because it is basically a map with one-to-one scale in the limit, right? So a map that's one-to-one scale needs to be so big that's not usable, right? So the real value of maps is that they keep things that might be important in other contexts out, so that we can concentrate on what is really critical to help us to go from A to B. So it's the same logic here when you're drawing a causal loop diagram. We don't need to draw the whole, all possible factors and all possible contributors and consequential relationships. That's not what we want. We want only what is critical to understand the internal dynamic. Okay. That might not be easy to get at the very beginning, right? So you don't know what contributors or consequences, the key for the dynamics here. So you might end up at the end of this step having a longer list of contributors and consequences. The thing is that, and that's fine. Think of this as a brainstorm stage. But as you move forward in the process, this list needs to be prioritized and narrowed down to the key contributors and the key consequences. So one example of what I tend to do, especially in group model building workshops, is ask people in small groups, for instance, or individually, to list a number of factors, either contributors or consequences, and then order them by relevance in their view. Okay. And then when I ask people to report back their factors they identified, they listed, I would never ask the full list. I would ask only the top 2 or 3 or 4, depending on the size of the groups, the number of groups, etc. So that means that although they start with a larger list, they actually had to prioritize them and just give us, share with everyone just the key ones that might explain the behavior of your system. Sorry. So another tip here is, if you're in doubt about including something, ask yourself, if I were to double half this factor, would it have a significant effect on the UCI mapping? If not, then you probably can omit that factor. So that's a rule of thumb that you can use when in doubt about adding or not a factor. Another key thing here is that not every factor, perhaps, or not every way of writing down a factor is going to be useful for an SLD. So there are some ways of writing down the name of variables or labeling the variables and factors that help you to have factors that can be then used in causal loop in developing your causal loop diagram. So one example here, I have 3 points here. These are 3 key guiding points I always use, is always to use or name your variables using nouns. So here's an example. Litigation leading to costs, right? So initially, someone wrote instead of cost, increasing cost. The fact that you have increasing costs, why is considered, the reason why it's considered not appropriate is that the increasing or decreasing aspect of this relationship is actually captured by the arrow. So if you just have costs, you can have litigations. As we increase litigations, costs will let's say increase, right? As you decrease litigations, costs will decrease. So if you have increasing costs, it makes it difficult to create that logic. So if litigations increase, I have increasing costs, or if I have decreasing litigation, I have increasing costs. That's difficult to elaborate. So always using nouns to name your variables. The second and very important thing is that your variables need to be measurable or quantifiable, let's say, so quantities, even if not quantifiable in the sense that you can, have a survey, for instance. So here I have an example. So I have rewards to happiness instead of state of mind. So state of minds are states, right? So I'm either happy, sad, excited, I don't know, a number of states. So there is no increase or decrease. There's no quantity here, right? Even though happiness is not something that you would usually quantify, but you can always change to increase or decrease. So I always say, I don't know if those 2 words exist in reality, but your variable should be increasable and decreasable. Okay, so if these words don't exist in English, they're still useful prompts of how your variable should look like. And the third one, which is not a key one, but is a preference, is to always use the positive sense of a variable if you have the option to use the negative or the positive. So here again, we have the example of growth or contraction. So in this case, the preferred use is growth, because it makes easier for us to explain it, even avoid a double negative. So if demand increases, growth increase, right? If demand increases, contraction decreases. So it is harder for our brains to get around that sentence, or harder than, if demand increases, growth also increases. Any questions about variable elicitation? No? I'll just go to the next one, and then we can have a discussion about these two stages next. So the next stage is structure elicitation. So in the structure elicitation, the key thing here is that using the contributors and consequences identified in the last stage, we need to demonstrate the operation of the system that generates the observed unexpected temporal trends, i.e. the reference mode. So that demonstration of how the system operates is the dynamic mechanistic hypothesis that you are generating. So you're basically explaining how the dynamic relationship between these factors over time generated observed or expected temporal trends. And this dynamic mechanistic hypothesis, it is your causal loop diagram. So your causal loop diagram is a dynamic hypothesis that tries to explain how that pattern that you mapped in the reference mode comes about. So that's why the reference mode is a key element that cannot be ignored during the process. So what we need to do to elicit the variable. So the elicitation of the structure. So the elicitation of a structure is basically a process where we draw a connection between factors. Okay. Here there are a few tips or considerations when drawing this connection. So first of all, we only need to draw causal and critical connections. So again, you're not trying to draw out the whole map. And it's a causal loop diagram, so only causal connections. We need to assign polarity to each connection. I will explain how we do it in the next slide. It might happen that you have a bidirection connection. So A affects B, and B in turn affects A. In this case, some people would draw a two-headed arrow. And that's not the suggested way of drawing this connection. But what you can do is to either have two opposite connections, so one going from A to B, separate from the one that goes from B to A. So it's easy in this way to see the feedback loop happening there. Otherwise, if you just had a two-headed arrow, you might just miss the identification of feedback loop. And the other option that will be clear when I show the image here is to check whether there is already an indirect pathway connecting these two factors. So instead of going from A to B and then B to A again, you might consider first where already exists a situation where A goes to B, B goes to C, and C goes back to A. And that's all you need to explain that relationship, instead of having another feedback loop going from A to B. Sorry, from B to A. If a connection can have both polarities, so let's say you have A to B, and when A increases, B also increases in some situations. But in other situations, you might have when A increases, B decreases. You might have two arrows going from A to B, and each one of them with different polarities. And then you need to detail the mechanisms that make one pathway a positive pathway and the other pathway a negative pathway. Never forget to consider how the consequences also contribute to shape the problem, so the cyclic or endogenous nature of your problem, which are demonstrated by the feedback loops. You don't need to use all the factors identified before. Maybe there are factors that now they're starting to at least the structure you perceive is not relevant anymore. Or even you might consider adding new factors because some of the explanatory pathways are not complete without the new factors that you need to add. So here's like a step-by-step process of how one could approach developing a causal diagram. So the first step is putting somewhere in your map the problem variable, your indicator. So in your case, the levels of cycling, right? Then we can start discussing what are the possible causes and relationship between causes, adding the consequences from your levels of cycling to then draw in the last stage, these feedback loops between consequences contributing to what at the beginning were contributing factors. So in this case, explaining the endogenous or cyclic nature of your problem. Some people have difficulties assigning polarity to arrows. In fact, in part because they consider whether the effect is going up or down. So here I have an example. So we have here four variables, right? Probability of healthy changes, outlet, staff, or manager time and resource required, manager willingness to implement healthy changes, and extension of changes implemented. So the S beside the arrowhead means that the two variables go in the same direction, as the equivalent of the plus signal in some of the other CLDs you saw. And the O means opposite direction. So when outlet, staff, and manager time and resource required to go up, the willingness go down. Some people for instance, depending on how they read the map, they actually might make the mistake of flagging these or marking this as a negative polarity. And that happens when, for instance, they say, well, the probability of health changes is decreasing. So the manager willingness willingness to implement health changes is also decreasing. So if it's decreasing, so this should be a minus signal. So that's the way or the reason why some people make this mistake. So they're actually looking at the direction of the effect. In reality, you need to look at the direction of effect in relation to the direction of the cause to define the polarity of the arrow. So here's an example. When probability and willingness go up, it's easy to see that they go in the same direction, so it should be a positive polarity. However, when they both go down, they still have the same direction. So the arrow here should still be positive, not negative. The same confusion sometimes is done when, for instance, resources go up and willingness go down. So it's easy to see, the direction of willingness and the direction of the minus signal have the same meaning here. So it's opposite direction, but it's also opposite direction. So a minus signal here, or when willingness is going up, if resources are going down. So it's never looking only at the effect that's going to define whether it's a plus or minus signal in the arrowhead or in the causal relationship. Is always the relationship, is always the cause in relation relative to the cause, always relative to the effect that defines the polarity of your arrow. Let me see what time it is now. I have 5 more minutes just to speak about the model review. If we can wait for the questions, is that okay? Yeah. So after we finish that element, so we have a draft CLD ready. The next step is the model review. So a few things to always consider after you have your first draft ready is first to ask yourself whether there are any factors or connections in excess or missing to explain the key system dynamics. So we always tend to think in things that might be missing, but we forget to ask ourselves whether the things are in excess. So that's also a good practice. And again, we're not trying to map every possible relationship. We're trying to create a map that explains the internal dynamics that generate the patterns we're observing. Need to confirm whether the variable names are correct and clear, if the connections, polarities are correct. If you didn't forget to consider whether and how the consequences also are drivers or contributors of the problem, so the endogenous or cyclic nature of your problem. Read the causal pathways, confirm that it makes sense. If there are any unformative redundancies, again, if there are things that are in excess, that can be deleted. And finally, is whether your diagram, which is your dynamic hypothesis, is compatible with the macro behavior of the system. So one example could be, having only, for instance, only positive reinforcing feedbacks in your map, and the only thing you see is that flat line happening in your observed behavior of your system. So if things are just reinforced internally, either going up or down, it's very unlikely that we would have a flat line for 10 years as a macro behavior, right? So we would expect to have either oscillating behavior or increasing behavior over time, or exponential decay, for instance. So if the dynamic hypothesis that you generated is not compatible with the macro behavior of your system, then you might need to go back and check what is missing or is wrong, perhaps, in your causal loop diagram that is not matching the macro behavior of the system. And finally, some tools and references for drawing CLD. So I left here some tools that you can use to draw CLDs. So the first three ones are online tools where you can find dedicated to draw CLDs. Kumu has features that allow you to draw other types of diagrams as well, but Loopy and Stick are specifically for CLDs. The first two are free. Sticky has a fee to use. You can use system dynamics platforms and software like Vensim and Stella as well. They have space or features that allow you to draw causal loop diagrams. If you are familiar with Muro or Miro, they are not tools to draw causal loop diagrams, but you can use their features to design loop diagrams. So you can use sticks as factors. You can draw arrows between factors, between stick nodes to mimic connections. So depending on how good you are using Muro or Miro, might be your preference. You can use other whiteboard applications if you want. The PowerPoint is one resource as well, maybe not the best one. It's also possible. Again, you can create nodes, arrows between the nodes, and put indicators of polarities for the arrows. And you can always use pen and paper effectively. And in terms of references, I left the three first ones are specifically about causal loop diagrams, and the last four are about things related with causal loop diagrams. So in terms of participatory systems mapping, if you're thinking on building a participatory workshop, Peter Hoffman's book is also about participatory modeling. Once you build your CLD, you might want to try to read the structure. So this material here is about system archetypes that you can use to help you read the CLD. And there is also Scriptpedia, which have scripts that can help you develop group model building workshops if this is something you are aiming for. So what we saw today was an overview of the steps to build a CLD, the problem definition, reference mode, factor and variable elicitation, structural elicitation, how to review the model, and some tools and reference for drawing CLDs. And that's all I have for today. I'm happy for us to have some time for discussions. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much, Leandro. I'm sure the applause was both physically and virtually coming through. So I know, Connie, your hand went up at some point earlier. I don't know if you wanted to come in, and there's also a question in the Q&A.
My question is related to Nina, so happy to cover Nina's first in the Q&A, and then I could follow up.
Sure. Nina, so I saw your question. I don't know if you wanted to come on or could read your question out.
I have to read my own question. So identifying possible causes and consequences. I was just wondering from your personal experience how you generally go about that if you're starting for the first time. Is it interviews? Is it just your own knowledge? Is it literature? How do you sort of tackle that first time?
Yeah, that's a good point. There's no one right source to use to identify causes and consequences. So, and you can use a mixture of sources. Let me just stop sharing my screen so I can also look at everyone. 1 second. Are you still looking at my screen, or are you looking? No, okay, sorry. So I guess then you already did it for me. Thank you. So yeah, there's no one, only one source that you can use, or you would be always used. So I participate in the process from all types, going from all factors have been identified in participatory workshops. In these cases, the important thing is that you ensure that the participants of your exercise can cover a wide range of several elements, several parts of your system. So for instance, if you're thinking of transport, or again, cycling among women as an example, of course, you might want to have NGOs and statutory bodies that are involved in transport. Maybe that's probably not enough. If you think, if there are elements that consider, for instance, the time challenges, or not only time challenge, but what's the word I'm looking for? The tasks, sometimes the household tasks, home tasks, attributed to, usually attributed to women in terms of care or taking kids to school, etc. So you might want to have women with lived experience of how it is to be women trying to cycle, in the room, and many of these information might not be available in the literature yet. Especially if you're speaking about CLDs for a given location with a very specific context. So that doesn't preclude you from, complement that process with also data coming from published papers or any other sources, reports or surveys from the same location. So yeah, I don't think there's a one source that I will always use or never use. I guess it's very dependent on the project.
If I can come in there, I guess my question was about your strong advice that not all factors need to be used, and a good map, a good diagram might be stripped down and usable. I guess I was wondering if you or anyone else on the call had experience on how you describe that process, especially in a publication, how you decided to drop some factors. I guess your example for the group model building was that you had an exercise of prioritization, but I guess it might be while you are kind of refining the model that some are dropped, and you might be, I don't know, informed by literature review or systematic review. So I guess how do you justify if you're dropping certain factors? Because I guess it's slightly organic, I guess, how you decide that something needs to be covered or not.
Yeah, well, all these CLDs I built, even those who were also informed by evidence from the literature, other sources that are not participants, I always got back to them to collectively decide what should be in and should be out. There are a few things you can also consider from a technical point of view. So causal diagrams are expected to try to capture the endogenous or cyclic dynamics or elements that generate the problem. So if you have, it's okay if you have what we call exogenous variables, so variables that only have outgoing arrows. But if you have many of them that are not actually actively contributed to the endogenous behavior, so they are potentially candidates to be, some of them at least, be excluded. Other things that also might happen is that, and it's very common. So you have a factor that we call is a dead end. So you have just factor arrows coming in, but not arrow going out. So it's definitely not contributing to any dynamic. So those are, for instance, factors that we could exclude. Yeah, so many of the processes I facilitate, I didn't put myself in the role of expert, but as a facilitator, even when I was a topic that was also part of my research area. So yeah, perhaps that's why I relied so much on the role of the participants. That makes sense.
Right, thank you.
I don't know if other people had different experiences and would like to share too.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's so another comment has come in from Claire. Claire, I can read it out, or if you wanted to come on,
Yeah,
please let us know.
That's a good question, Claire, and that's not the only setting perhaps where you perhaps don't have a good indicator. You might work in other places where.
Sorry, I don't think we can all see the question. Could you just?
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Thanks.
The question that Claire asked is, to what extent can you use CLDs for problems without data or obvious measurable indicators? I do health services research, and we think about, for instance, inter-service communication, and there isn't always something that is currently or could be measured to rate this. Although I can see how mapping out potential causal hypotheses would be useful to help improve this. So yeah, that's a good point. More important than having a measurable indicator, Claire, or is to have an indicator, even if it's not being measured, right? That even if it's a proxy of something, let's say that it is a problem where that doesn't contain anything that is even potentially measurable, okay? Not for technical reasons, because there is no way of measuring what you mean. But if it's a proxy of that, so let's say if it's about inter-service communication, the problem is inter-service communication. If a proxy measure could be, for instance, a quality of, just come up with one here. I'm not sure if it's that useful. So quality of, frequency of good quality communication between sectors. Okay, it's not something that you measure. It's not something that probably even possible to measure. But if you, perhaps together with other colleagues from other sectors or other services you are trying to build this map together with, can come up with a shape perhaps of that behavior. So it's a cyclic, so the quality of that communication goes up and down over time, or it has been declining over time, or it has been improving over time. So what is the perception you have as members, as those living within that system about the communication? Is improving, is going better? It was improving, now got to a plateau a few years ago, and now it's starting to decline again. So that's more important. So the shape of that trend is more important than the actual measure or numeric measurements that you might have, if that makes sense. That helps you, Claire, or not really?
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Claire. So I think just keeping an eye on time, and I haven't seen any other questions or comments coming through. So I think maybe we can bring this webinar to a close. So a huge thanks again, Leandro, for speaking to us today and delivering the session. Thanks also to everyone for the questions and discussion points. This webinar has been recorded and will be uploaded shortly to our YouTube channel. For information on our next series, on our next webinar, we'll be hosting Dr. Paraskevi Safaradi next month, Tuesday, the 19th of March, 12 to 1, speaking on systems dynamics. I believe Evie's even on, or was on the call at some point, so it's good to see you. So until then, thank you again, and hopefully see you soon.